September 15, 1940, over the fields and coastal towns of Kent in southeast England. The air is crowded with contrails, radio chatter, and the hard geometry of formation flying. Below, civilians glance up between sirens and shelter doors. Above, RAF fighter command scrambles to meet a mass daylight attack that German planners hope will finally break the British defensive system. It is a scene that later becomes a symbol, but in the air, it is simply work. Find the enemy, commit, survive, return, and go again. The familiar stereotype says Luftwaffe pilots dismissed RAF flyers as timid amateurs. German impressions in 1940 were sharper and more pragmatic. Many German airmen arrived from victories in Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France, where campaigns moved fast and opponents could be overwhelmed by combined air and ground pressure. Britain presented a different problem. The Luftwaffe had been shaped mainly as a close support air force, not as a tool for a long strategic offensive against a defended homeland. Over southern England, the enemy was not just a fighter in the sky, but an integrated defense of radar warning, ground observers, and fighter control that could concentrate squadrons at the point of attack and then do it again an hour later. What impressed and frustrated German pilots was method. RAF squadrons reformed under pressure, attacked in disciplined passes, and returned even after losses, sometimes flying multiple sorties in a single day. The pool of men was limited. Just under 3,000 RAF aircrew took part across the Battle of Britain's official period from July 10 to October 31, 1940. The losses were severe. 544 fighter command pilots were killed, roughly 1 in 6. Yet sorties continued, and the visible effects of fatigue did not translate into collapse. Instead, German pilots increasingly met opponents who were aggressive when they could be, cautious when they needed to be, and consistently guided into the fight by a ground system that reduced waste and preserved strength. For German fighter leaders, that persistence was matched by the qualities of British aircraft and how they were employed. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was formidable, but its time over Britain was constrained by fuel and geography. RAF pilots fought close to their bases and under a control system that could place them at the right height and the right place with unnerving frequency. In memoirs and post-war reflections, leading Luftwaffe aces described a grudging admiration for RAF flying skill and discipline, and an even deeper respect for the organization behind them. That respect, however, did not mean Germans viewed RAF pilots in only one way, because as the war widened beyond 1940, the RAF they faced began to change. That change began almost immediately after the crisis of 1940. When German pilots thought about the RAF in the later war, many no longer pictured only Spitfires and Hurricanes climbing into sunlit contrails. They increasingly pictured the long, cold night war. Bombers crossing the North Sea, searchlights over the Ruhr, flak towers and radar screens, and the grinding contest between bomber streams and German night fighters. For Luftwaffe aircrew tasked with defending the Reich, British airmen were no longer just opponents at the edge of fuel range over Kent. They were the crews who returned again and again to the same industrial basins, forcing Germany to fight a defensive battle over its own cities and production. From the German perspective, this was a stark contrast in character and mission. In daylight fighter combat, individual skill, split-second judgment, and formation discipline dominated memory. In the night bombing campaign, the RAF became an industrial system in the sky. Large forces, navigational aids, electronic countermeasures, specialized pathfinder units, and a deliberate attempt to saturate defenses. The experience of German night fighter crews and flak batteries was of an enemy that could be frustrated and damaged, but not easily deterred. The RAF's bombing offensive became one of the longest and most costly campaigns of the war, and that cost shaped how Germans judged the men flying it. German respect was often rooted in endurance more than romantic notions of chivalry. Bomber command crews operated under a level of sustained risk that few other air forces asked of such young men for so long. More than 55,000 aircrew died flying with RAF Bomber Command during the war, a scale of loss that was widely known after the conflict and is central to how the campaign is remembered. Even during the war, German defenders could see the pattern. The RAF absorbed punishing attrition, adapted tactics, and kept the pressure on, shifting from early, less effective raids toward increasingly concentrated attacks on industrial regions such as the Ruhr in 1943. At the same time, German perceptions were never purely admiring. because the night war was inseparable from the destruction it caused. To many in Germany, the RAF was associated with fear, ruin, and a belief that Britain was waging a harsh form of warfare against the Reich cities and workforce. That emotional reality mattered because it meant German views of RAF airmen split into two simultaneous impressions: the crews as formidable professionals in a technically sophisticated campaign, and the crews as the face of a bombing war that felt personal, relentless, and morally searing. And it was inside that tension, respect for skill and endurance, anger at effects on the ground, that German opinions about RAF pilots took their most complicated form. That complexity deepened as the night contest turned into a duel of systems rather than single combats. German air defense was not improvised. By 1940 and 1941, it was evolving into a layered network of early warning radar, searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and controlled night fighters guided toward intruders. In German thinking, that structure was meant to make the airspace over the Reich predictable and lethal, a series of defended zones that could be managed from the ground and fed with fresh crews. But the RAF learned quickly that the way to survive was not simply to fly better, but to outthink the defense with organization, deception, and technology. From German cockpits and radar rooms, the RAF's most striking trait became adaptability. British air crews were not viewed as reckless amateurs blundering through darkness. They were increasingly seen as crews supported by a growing scientific and operational machine. Improved navigation, more precise target marking, and tactics designed to overload defenses. When Bomber Command concentrated large forces into a narrower window of time and space, German defenders experienced not a scattered nuisance but a sudden flood. When the RAF introduced better ways to find and mark targets in poor visibility, German reports reflected a grudging recognition that Britain was learning to turn a difficult night mission into a repeatable method. This created a new kind of respect, even among those who despised the results on the ground. German night fighter crews often described RAF bombers as tough to bring down, especially once four-engine heavies dominated the bomber force. The defensive armament, the discipline of formations, and the sheer number of aircraft moving through the night meant that a successful interception was never routine. At the same time, RAF crews were also judged by German defenders through a harsh lens of efficiency. How well they navigated, how consistently they appeared, and how quickly they evolved countermeasures. In other words, Germans increasingly thought about RAF pilots as the human operators of a high-pressure system, young men trained to execute a dangerous procedure repeatedly, not a romantic set of lone duelists. And that shift matters because it explains why German opinions could sound contradictory. The same defender could describe RAF crews as formidable and professional, while also seeing them as the agents of a campaign that struck cities at night and demanded a response from every part of German society. Respect and resentment did not cancel each other out. They ran in parallel. By the middle years of the war, the question was no longer whether RAF pilots would come back after losses. The question was what happened to German morale, German industry, and German air defenses when they kept coming in ever more coordinated ways. As the contest intensified, German perceptions of RAF airmen were shaped less by myth and more by repeated contact with a machine that could absorb punishment and still return on schedule. The RAF's ability to keep mounting large raids was not simply a matter of courage in the cockpit. It reflected an entire wartime system of training, maintenance, navigation, and control that Germany struggled to disrupt permanently. Even in the earlier daylight crisis of 1940, what many German pilots truly ran up against was not only the individual in the opposing aircraft, but the British defensive method that could keep squadrons coming despite losses. During the official Battle of Britain period, the number of fighter command pilots killed is commonly cited as 544, a figure preserved in British remembrance and casualty records, and it helps explain why German airmen could simultaneously respect RAF persistence and expect the system to crack, because the human margin for error was thin. But it did not crack. Instead, as the war shifted toward the defense of Germany itself, the Luftwaffe's night fighter and flak communities encountered a different kind of RAF professionalism: operational discipline under sustained attrition. British memorial and historical summaries record that 55,573 aircrew died while serving with RAF Bomber Command, a scale of loss that underlines how frequently German defenders were facing crews who were statistically unlikely to survive a full tour, yet still executed procedures with training and coordination. German views were also influenced by the continuous duel of measure and countermeasure. The German night air defense structure known to the Allies as the Kammhuber Line was built around radar, searchlights, and ground-controlled night fighters in controlled zones, designed to make interception systematic rather than accidental. The RAF's response, most famously concentrating bombers into a bomber stream to saturate those controlled zones during major raids, was experienced by German crews as an enemy that learned how to exploit the seams of a defensive system, not merely one that relied on bravery alone. So, when Germans spoke after the war about what they really thought of RAF pilots, the most consistent thread was not a single emotion but a contradiction. Admiration for the competence and endurance of the men in the air, set against anger and dread over what their missions did on the ground. And as the RAF expanded into new roles, fighter sweeps, intruder operations, and tactical air power, the next layer of German opinion formed around a more immediate question. Not just how skilled RAF pilots were, but how decisively Britain was learning to use air power to shape the battlefield itself. What hardened German respect in the last phase of the war was how completely the RAF moved from defending Britain to controlling the battlefield. By the time Allied armies returned to Northwest Europe, the RAF facing German troops was not just a fighter force or a bomber force. It was a tactical air system designed to support an invasion and then strangle German movement by day. The RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force was formed in June 1943 specifically to prepare for operations like Overlord, pulling together fighters, fighter bombers, light bombers, reconnaissance, and the control organizations needed to link aircraft to fast-moving ground combat. From a German point of view on the ground, that produced a different kind of pilot reputation. The fear was not only of being shot down in the air, but of being found on a road, in a rail yard, at a bridge, or in a staging area, and then hit before the column could disperse. RAF history summaries of the D-Day Air Plan emphasized the months of low-level tactical reconnaissance and intelligence gathering over Normandy, and then the constant rhythm of sorties once the invasion began. To German units trying to move in daylight, RAF pilots became the visible tip of a system that combined reconnaissance, radio control, and immediate strike power. That strike power had its own symbols, and one of the most recognizable was the rocket-armed fighter bomber. The British 3-inch rocket projectile known as the RP-3 entered service during the war and became widely associated with aircraft like the Hawker Typhoon, which by 1943 was shifting decisively into the ground attack role. RAF academic and institutional writing on the Normandy period notes that the rocket was a blunt instrument, powerful but not magically precise, and yet it still changed what German crews felt they could do in daylight when aircraft were overhead. In German memory, this created a last and very practical assessment of RAF pilots. Not simply brave or skilled, but operationally suffocating. Fighter Command in 1940 had shown that Britain could refuse to break. Bomber Command's night offensive showed Germany that Britain could sustain pressure for years, at terrible cost. Then the tactical air forces showed that once the Allies returned to the continent, German mobility itself could be made dangerous. And that is the key answer to the title. German views of RAF pilots were not a single stereotype. They were shaped by repeated contact with RAF methods, disciplined defense, adaptive bombing systems, and then battlefield air control that left fewer and fewer safe options. And by 1944 and 1945, even German fighter pilots who still met the RAF in the air were increasingly encountering a mature opponent shaped by years of experience. The RAF of the late war was not the small force improvising under invasion threat. It was an air force with hardened squadron leadership, a deep bench of instructors and operational testers, and a professional approach to tactics that had been refined under pressure. In practical terms, German airmen learned that RAF pilots could be expected to fight with discipline rather than bravado, and to rely on control, timing, and cooperation, whether that was a defensive scramble, a coordinated night raid, or a tactical strike tied to a ground plan. So what did Germans really think about RAF pilots? They often started with confidence in 1940, then ran into an opponent whose system would not collapse. Many came to respect the individual flying skill they faced, but even more they respected the method behind it. Britain's ability to put pilots in the right place, keep them supplied, absorb losses, and still innovate. At the same time, German opinions were never purely admiring. The longer the war went on, the more RAF airmen were associated with the destruction of German cities, the fear of sirens, and the sense that the air war had become total. In other words, German perceptions were a blend of professional respect and bitter resentment, both intensified by repetition. That is the most honest conclusion. Not a legend of chivalry, not a cartoon of contempt, but an evolving judgment formed in combat, respect for competence and endurance, sharpened by the harsh reality of what air power could do when it was organized, sustained, and used without pause. If you found this breakdown useful, like the video, subscribe for more World War II documentaries, and comment where you're watching from. If you enjoy this content and want to support the channel, click the join button below. Members get exclusive perk and help me make more videos like this.